Water. It's the magic liquid that brings our so-called blue planet to life. Canada is particularly lucky. Approximately 20% of the world's fresh water is contained in this country's aquifers, rivers, and lakes. Near the center of Canada is one of the country's most beautiful water bodies, the Lake of the Woods. Most of the Lake of the Woods sits on ruggedly glaciated bedrock, and it is spackled with thousands of wooded islands. Rich in wildlife, popular with recreational visitors of all kinds, the lake is infinitely various, with urban harbors, cottage communities, and wilderness reaches where it is rare to see a human being. The lake is so rich that it would be almost impossible for one person to truly know its history, geography, and countless stories. But a great place to start is the Kenora Discovery Center, where today we will take a journey back in time with well-known journalist Sean Kavanagh.
For some people, their hobby is maybe collecting spoons or playing some golf. For me, it's Lake of the Woods. I've been coming here for more than 5 decades now, and I can't wait to get out on the lake and do a little more exploring. And I can't wait to get out there today.
The best way to explore the Lake of the Woods is by boat, and Sean begins his journey at the north end of the lake, where highways, railways, river, and lake converge to service the towns of Kenora and Keewatin.
So that's the Keewatin Bridge in the background. Built in 1938, it was the longest span across a body of water on the entire Trans-Canada Highway. Bit of an architectural and engineering miracle, really. We'll leave it behind and head out on the lake.
In the late 1800s, the Canadian Pacific Railway spurred the development of those towns, and the islands, clustered at the north end of the lake, provide a home for some of Canada's finest old cottages. Many of them are more than a century old.
So just to the starboard, the Royal Lake of the Woods Yacht Club. This has been the social hub for this part of Lake of the Woods since 1903. The wealthy grain barons of Winnipeg wanted a place to relax, play some games, have a little competitive sailing, and do some socializing. If you look really closely inside that little structure in front, you'll see a bell. In the old days, when they wanted to start a sailing race or end a sailing race, they'd bang on that bell. And even today, when the MS Kenora, the local tour boat, comes by, typically somebody will come down and bang on the bell so that the tourists can have a look and have a listen.
It's a world of water, the Lake of the Woods, and a journey out into its countless islands is also a journey into the past. History is everywhere.
So we're coming what's called the back channel, or the second channel. This body of water never freezes. The current in here is so strong, ice doesn't get a chance to form up. And as we come around this corner, we're coming into one of the most notorious areas at this end of the lake. It's called the Tangle, and it's called that because there are rocks and islands everywhere. And it's not always well marked off with buoys like that one. We come down the channel, you can see this is sort of a perfect tale of two boathouses. On our left, that boathouse was built about 25 years ago, and it actually houses a bunch of old turn-of-the-century boats. On the right, this boathouse is probably 100 years old, and it's still standing. But you gotta watch coming through this channel, because there's a reef right in the middle.
As Sean travels through the labyrinth of islands and channels, he is constantly reminded of stories from the lake's past.
We're coming into a very special section of the lake for me. It's called Holmstrom's Marsh. You can see along the shoreline the marsh and the beautiful flowers that are growing in there. Well, 100 years ago, this channel was solid marsh. And along that shore was a farm. And the farmer's name was Eric Holmstrom. And Eric had in his mind that it would be better for people driving down the lake to navigate down this channel than go on the other side of that island. The other side of that island is the Manitou Stretch, is one of the most open sections of water at this part of Lake of the Woods. So in 1913, Eric Holmstrom started cutting out the marsh in here. And he would take it out with huge saws. It took him till the 1940s to complete. But eventually, people were able to drive down the channel and get down the lake without getting out on the big Manitou Stretch. So how's this for your front yard? My wife and I lived in that cottage for 5 seasons, winter and summer, running our little business on Lake of the Woods, taking care of other cottages. And it was an incredible place to live. A marsh is a special ecosystem. And every day you could look out the kitchen window of that cottage across the channel and you could see the plaque dedicated to Eric Holmstrom and Carl Malmo, the 2 guys that cut out this channel and made it safe to drive in. Coming through here, you get a choice. It's sort of like a fork in the road. You go to the right, you go down the Welcome Channel, which is the best way to get down to Clearwater Bay. If you go to the left, I mentioned the Manitou Stretch. Well, that's this big open body of water just coming up to the left.
The Lake of the Woods may have its pioneering stories and elegant cottages, but the Manitou Stretch is a reminder that there are other, less genteel sides to the lake. The Manitou Stretch can be a frightening place, a wide open expanse of water often rocked by high winds and dangerous waves. The word Manitou means great spirit in a number of indigenous languages, and the Manitou Stretch is a reminder that other cultures and other peoples have their own traditions here. Traditions that were established long before cottagers and powerboats arrived. In the center of the Manitou Stretch is a strange-looking hump of bald rock. It looks forbidding, and it is.
Many, many years ago, a canoeing party was coming across the stretch and they heard drumming coming from the island. So they went to investigate, and when they went ashore, they couldn't find anybody, but the drumming continued. And legend has it that because of that, nobody should go on the island. It wasn't for people, and it became Manitou Island. But of course, the cormorants and the seagulls haven't heard about that legend, and they don't mind using the island. We're in the cove of probably one of the most beautiful islands on this part of Lake of the Woods, Whiskey Island. And it's got a great backstory and why it got that name.
The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway in the 1880s was an important chapter in the development of the Lake of the Woods. Whiskey Island is a long way from the railway, but even at this distance, the massive construction project made its mark. Thousands of rough and ready young men were involved in the building of the railway, and maintaining discipline was a major challenge for the CPR. Prostitutes, bootleggers, and gamblers followed the construction camps, luring the railway workers away from their jobs. So the CPR made a rule that no dens of iniquity were to be allowed within 7 miles of the railway track. This beautiful island happens to be exactly 7 miles from the railhead. Brothels and saloons operated under canvas along the edge of the beach, and a fast steamer did big business ferrying enthusiastic customers back and forth to Whiskey Island from Kenora.
There's a further story that this island was actually a transition point for liquor during the Prohibition days, and legend has it that there's a cache of whiskey somewhere on the island that nobody's ever found. Of course, in my younger days, we went and looked for it and never found it. Today, it's a private island, and you're not allowed to go on and look for the whiskey. made a quick diversion off the main track going south to pass into one of what I think is the nicest little bays on the lake. It's called Micrometer Bay. There's lots of deep water and great anchorages if you're in a keelboat, a sailboat, or a cabin cruiser. It's so deep, the shoreline just comes right down into the lake. There's lots of water under your keel. And then when you get to the end of Micrometer Bay, there's this little dock in the middle of nowhere. Something you don't find way down the lake. A convenient little floating dock. Just pop her in like this. There you go. So the dock's the first surprise you get at the back end of Micrometer Bay. The next one, we'll grab the camera here, is that there's a trail. So let's go do some exploring. The trail's maintained. You can see some of the logs have been cut in the last few years. And you get down to the end of the trail, Brocket Lake. And a couple of boats, actually 3 boats. Now we're not going to be able to take them out on the lake, chained up to the dock. They're owned by local lodge owners. They guide their customers down the path and they take them out for a fish on Brocket Lake, which is one of hundreds of inland lakes around Lake of the Woods and on some of the major islands out here. Brocket's a beautiful one, it really is. That just curves right around, it's really narrow and clear. You can see right to the bottom everywhere. It's just gorgeous. So let's go have a look at Brocket from another perspective. Wow, just fabulous. Totally worth the climb. We should get back out on Lake of the Woods. And here we go, back out on the lake. So we're coming up on Crow Rock Island here. If you're gonna head south down Lake of the Woods, one time or another, you're going to pass by Crow Rock Island. Crow has got some of the most beautiful cliffs on Lake of the Woods. Look at them straight up into the sky. You can see that red coloration on the rocks. That's a lichen that grows on them.
Almost half of Canada is covered by the smooth glaciated granite of the Precambrian Shield. Much of the Lake of the Woods, however, is constructed of brittle volcanic rock that has crumbled under the centuries of the freeze-thaw cycle. Crow Rock Island is a spectacular example of this ancient geology. Its tall cliffs resemble the broken walls of an ancient fortress.
One of those great Lake of the Woods white pines. And if you look closely, right above the white pine, you'll see an eagle cruising on guard, looking for fish, maybe keeping a mind on his nest. Navigating on Lake of the Woods is all about what you can't see and what you can see. The point is here that there are only so many buoys marking reefs on the lake, and there are thousands more that'll come up and bite your motor right where it lives.
With so many unmarked reefs and shallows, the Lake of the Woods is a challenge to get around by boat. Moving people and goods around the lake was even more difficult in the 1800s, when most reefs were unmarked, and large steamboats plied the lake without benefit of modern navigational equipment, hauling freight and passengers from one end of the lake to the other. Some were enormous, like the SS Kenora, and some, like this one, were just small commuters that used a steam boiler instead of a gas engine. Many of those boats came to grief on unmarked reefs. Here, in a quiet backwater, lies the grave of the Edna Bridges.
And then popped up right in the middle of this tiny little bay. What have you got there? How about this for the junk of another century? The boiler of the steamboat Edna Bridges. She was 75 feet long, could carry 60 passengers, and she did it in style. White linen tablecloths, and you could order caviar on board. She drove from Kenora to Fort Francis, and it took about 9.5 hours. There were dozens of similar steamboats plying Lake of the Woods. Get into this, and it's quite clear there's been a big forest fire in here. Just took everything on this little peninsula out. You can see the fire didn't get to these trees along the shore. Wow. It's a sight you don't see on Lake of the Woods very often, actually.
So we're coming to the mouth of the Tranquil Channel, and we're really at the tipping point to the southern part of Lake of the Woods. You can see a number of these beautiful, tiny little channels that you almost think that you couldn't drive a boat down, but you can. And if you look to our right, that's Denoyan Island. Denoyan apparently was the first Frenchman ever to make it to Lake of the Woods, well before La Vérendrye did. Why they call it Tranquil Channel. Even with the wind heavy, you'll be able to drive down here without much problem.
So we're in Portage Bay. It took us about an hour and a half to drive down from Kenora. This is one of the most beautiful bays. And if you look to my left, you can see some absolutely gorgeous rock cuts. There are Indian petroglyphs in many locations across Lake of the Woods. Some of them pretty easy to see, some of them pretty hard to tell. If you look closely on this tower of rocks right here, you'll see two red lines right up just a meter above the water line. And then if you look just above there, there's a red hand pushed against the rock. This was done hundreds of years ago. Now I'm going to try and maneuver up close. What you'll find in a number of petroglyph locations is that people will leave a small offering as a sign of respect. You should never, ever, ever touch any of these things. They're very sacred to the indigenous people, and they need to be treated with caution and respect. Just incredible thing, sheer rock faces. You wonder about this rubble and whether or not it came off when the glacier passed through, or did it come off from erosion. You can see where a big chunk of that cliff fell off, and some of the rubble's down here. Almost like a stone cutter came with some tools and sheared off part of the rock.
You can't travel anywhere on the Lake of the Woods, or in Canada for that matter, without coming across the ancient footprints of David Thompson. Born destitute in London in 1770, David Thompson was raised in a charity hospital, but he was smart and ambitious enough to get a job with the Hudson Bay Company. The company wanted him to apprentice as a fur trader, but Thompson wanted to be an explorer. So after finishing his assignment with the HBC, he went to work for the Northwest Company, who appointed him surveyor. It was a smart move on Thompson's part, because he eventually became one of the greatest map makers of all time.
Group of rocks put here 1824 by David Thompson. The muscle power it must have taken to get these rocks all piled up like this. Can't imagine. David Thompson. He was called Kukusint by indigenous people. That's you who look at stars. And it's because he would take a sextant and take shots of the stars in order to do his boundaries and his mapping.
One of Thompson's most difficult assignments was helping to map the boundary between the newly formed United States of America and British colonial Canada. Up until that time, no one in either country had good information about the geography of Lake of the Woods. The best map of the time suggested that the lake was oval in shape and had 9 islands. Years of haggling ensued, with bumbling surveying parties getting lost in the maze of islands and channels. After 40 years, both countries agreed to a boundary that looks like it was drawn by late-night revelers from Whiskey Island. Thompson's survey markers still remain, however, and one of them is on a tiny island in Monument Bay. The strangest result of the border dispute is still with us today. It's called the Northwest Angle, a small piece of Minnesota totally surrounded by Canadian water and soil. When Minnesota postal workers, state troopers, and other government employees head off to work in the morning, they must first leave the United States, drive through Canada, and then re-enter the U.S. at the border of the Northwest Angle. Canadians also experience the bizarre impracticality of the erratic border when they head south on Lake of the Woods. By law, boaters have to check in with United States Customs and Border Protection at the Northwest Angle, at a backwoods phone booth equipped with a phone and video camera.
That's right. We're off to Fort St. Charles.
So here we are at Fort St. Charles. I remember coming here as a 12-year-old kid, driving across Lake of the Woods, and then there it is, on an island in the middle of nowhere practically, a fort. But it's not the original fort, it's a replica. Fort St. Charles Dock is what the sign says. In 1731, La Vérendrye left Montreal. He had 50 men with him, including 3 of his sons and a nephew. And by the time they got to Lake of the Woods, they decided to build a fort. And here it is, Fort St. Charles. So when the Knights of Columbus restored the fort after the archaeologists had sort of pictured everything, they were able to map out where each room or building was in the fort. Place for mess hall, bunk houses, gunpowder magazine, and these extraordinary towers. Yeah, these towers, they immediately caught my eye. I had to check them out. I ran up and looked out this window and think about those fur traders, the young guys, 14, 15, 16 years old, thousands of kilometers from Quebec, from their homes. This might have been another planet. It was so far away from what they would have considered civilization and so difficult to get here. Portages and rivers and lakes. This fort must have been a welcoming place in a very, very strange land. A reproduction of the chapel that was in Fort St. Charles, this big altar in memory of Father Jean-Pierre Aulneau and Pierre La Vérendrye by the Knights of Columbus. There were 21 men originally buried here at Fort St. Charles, and 19 of those bodies remain in these grounds. 2 others, that of La Vérendrye's son Jean-Baptiste and Father Jean Aulneau, were taken eventually to St. Boniface, and that's where their remains are to this day. We're right on the border between Canada and the United States, just a little bit on the Canadian side. Just over on my right is Oak Island. On my left is Birch Island, which is the First Nations property. And right in front of us is the Traverse, the biggest piece of open water on Lake of the Woods.
This part of the lake forms a boundary between the Great North Woods and the beginnings of the Great Plains. The Ojibwe are generally a woodland culture, and they had a history of conflict and war with the Lakota Sioux of the plains. The Ojibwe had canoes, but the Sioux had horses. And because of these impressive technologies, neither side dared set foot on the other's territory. When fur traders arrived with guns and valuable trade goods, these long-standing hostilities were inflamed. Traders sometimes worsened matters by favoring one native group over another. When La Vérendrye arrived on Lake of the Woods, he didn't realize that these resentments were about to explode.
So just coming up on Massacre Island, and there's a story behind this island, but actually there's a mystery behind this island, and it's been one that's been debated for decades, almost centuries. It's nice to get out of the big stretch of water on the other side. A little bit heavy, coming in hot. There we go. The winter of 1736 was hard on the men at Fort St. Charles. Cold winter, and their food supplies were low. La Vérendrye reported they were eating moldy fish in the dead of winter. They were waiting for supplies. There had been a supply caravan on its way for some time, and by June, La Vérendrye decided to send men back to look for those supplies. He put his son, Jean-Baptiste, Father Jean Alno, and 19 others into canoes and sent them east looking for their supplies. June 5th, La Vérendrye sends 21 men and 3 canoes going east to look for his resupply mission. 12 days later, 2 canoes and some men from that resupply mission show up at Fort St. Charles. And they haven't seen a glimpse of the 3 canoes and the 21 fellas that had left a few days earlier. Just 17 days after the men left, La Vérendrye gets grim news. There's been a massacre. All 21 men, his son and Father Jean Alno, all dead. They've been decapitated and scalped. Now, there's been intense speculation as to where the attack occurred. Early in the 20th century, Jesuit priests from St. Boniface believed it was here on Massacre Island, and so they erected this cross to mark the spot. Now, there is some strong evidence that Massacre Island isn't the site of the attack. But what we do know is that the fur traders had to go from Fort St. Charles to Rainy River. And as much as possible, they'd have to try and avoid this huge expanse of water when they were doing it. It's probably a pretty good bet that in an effort to avoid the high winds and high waves, they came by this island. Up through the Painted Rock Channel. This is the site of some of the best petroglyphs on Lake of the Woods, some of the most clear and accessible. You can see why the artist might have been compelled to pick this spot on Lake of the Woods. Look at that. I especially like the man with the horns. Incredible. You can see why they chose this big chunk of the Canadian Shield. It's like a huge screen or a tablet. You can see it from across the bay. It would be amazing. You'd be able to tell from on the far shore there was something written here many, many years ago.
There are over 14,000 islands on Lake of the Woods, and each one is unique. Even better, Most of them are Crown land, owned and protected for you, the public. Anyone has a right to picnic or camp overnight on Crown land, as long as they respect the landscape and wildlife and exercise extreme caution with campfires.
So we're still not getting a break on some sunshine. It's getting later in the day, but we did find a perfect spot to pitch in for the night.
The idea is to make sure you leave nothing but footprints. This part of the Lake of the Woods is many hours of travel from so-called civilization, so Sean is going to camp out overnight. And what better place to be on a beautiful summer evening?
So we got the tent set up and a good fire going. We've got a great beach and a rock outcrop. Perfect spot for our second night out on Lake of the Woods. And I'm going to take a break before dinner and check out the view. And it doesn't matter if it's cloudy or sunny. It's one of the best views in the world. Nights like this bring out the best of Lake of the Woods for me. But I also think about the history of the place. It is a crossroads in Canada, and it is the most special place I've ever been to. I said that some people collect spoons or play golf. I collect memories on Lake of the Woods.
Biome is a word that scientists use to describe a large, naturally occurring region of distinct flora and fauna. The Lake of the Woods is a meeting place of many biomes. It's where the rocky lakes and evergreen forests of the Precambrian Shield meet the flat and fertile Great Plains. The rocky outcrops of the Shield were once mountains, and as they eroded over time, soil and sand were deposited in the south end of the lake, creating beautiful beaches in what was once an inland sea stretching all the way to the Rockies. The lake hasn't changed for millennia, so events that happened centuries ago seem to lurk around every corner.
We're headed through right in between the Sable Islands. It's just worth a historical note. Back in 1870, Colonel Wolseley and 1,200 men had to make this passage to get to Winnipeg and the Red River Rebellion. 1,200 men, their supplies, cannons, and weapons. And they would have come out on this huge bay and had to figure out a way to get across. They used York boats, as a matter of fact. And boy, what a slog. They would have come through the forest all the way from Thunder Bay. No road, no rail, just hoofing it. The beach comes pretty far out, almost 100 meters in some places, so the only way to get on to Sable is to use human power to pull the boat. The water's nice too. The debate about where the Le Vérandre supply party was murdered has gone on for years, and some have vigorously held the position that it happened on Massacre Island, on the other side of the Big Traverse. However, there's a body of thought that that's not right, that it happened down here near the Sable Islands. It makes sense because every voyageur, every explorer had to go through the Rainy River to exit or enter Lake of the Woods, and that's just on the other side of the Sables here. Now, in 1826, the explorer David Thompson made a map, and on his map he wrote, "Isles of the Dead. Here a priest and several Canadians were killed by the Sioux." Sadly, we have to end our journey here today. We've seen a lot of the western portion of Lake of the Woods, but there's still so much on the east. As you drive the eastern shore, you go through the towns of Morrison, Nestor Falls, and Sioux Narrows. And there's so much more history to discover. Abandoned mines, old POW camps, the logging industry that boomed here 100 years ago. Those are stories we have to see, and you'll see them in the next episode.
Water, water, and more water, as far as the eye can see. Golden islands, unblemished beaches, fresh air. As Canadians, we must never forget how lucky we are to roam these public lands, camping where we please, finding our way by map and compass, learning about the history and landscape of our own country as we go. Sean Kavanagh has spent 40 years exploring the Lake of the Woods and says he still learns something every time he goes out. Join us in the next episode as he continues his journey of discovery.